Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I am Tom Ricks, and this is the second in a new series I'm calling Shermaning the Culture War. And today I'm going to talk about the price of being a dick. And specifically speaking, I'm talking about what I'm observing on Twitter today, which amuses me to no end, which is that historical facts that have always been the case are now being reframed thanks in large part to Make America Great Again. So, two brief history lessons, right? The first one is the Alamo, right? So, before I even go into the actual Alamo itself, for those not familiar, let's talk about what it technically means in popular American culture, at least up until now, right? When you hear Remember the Alamo, you think of fierce, independent American spirit defending a righteous cause against impossible odds. At least that's what my perception as a white American growing up in the 80s and 90s really saw, right? So the fact of the matter is that what it actually was a mess. It wasn't necessarily, neither side was great. I'm not a big fan of both sides. I'm kind of judgy about history. I usually pick one side or the other, but it's a little bit harder in the case of the Alamo. And the reason I say that is because on the one side, you had the Mexican army, which Mexico was basically run by a dictator. I'm not a fan of Santa Anna, dictator for life, who basically threw out elections and basically was not a good guy. And on the other hand, you have rich white slave-owning Texans. And needless to say that while Texas had elections, there were certain African-American citizens of, inhabitants of Texas that didn't get a vote, right? So what you had in the Alamo was a situation where Santa Anna wanted Texas colonized, and the Texans were more than happy to oblige to do this until they were asked to, pay taxes and such. And there was a revolt, and in the long term, the Texans won, in large part thanks to the intervention of the American military, which led to this little thing called the MexicanAmerican War, and a vast expansion of territory for the American Empire. The Alamo in general, except as a popular phrase like Geronimo or Leroy Jenkins. In Texas, remember the Alamo, they are taught from day one in elementary school about the actual Alamo and how these 200 brave American, soldiers stood up against these vicious 20,000 Mexican soldiers, and it was basically a slaughter, and they were totally martyrs. And it was, it's not so cut and dry, right? The Mexicans were not slavers. And the Mexicans just wanted them to pay their freaking taxes, and taxation is not theft. So Texas is even more south than the South, because they did the whole, no, screw you, government type thing 20 years before the South did. And slavery is part of the reason all this happened, right? Mexico was not pro-slavery. Texas was pro-slavery. And until the Civil War happened, Texas stayed pro-slavery for, 20-some years. The fact of the matter is, however, that in American culture, because of the attempt by the left and the right to reconcile the South with popular American culture, and, let's not forget the fact, folks, that Birth of a Nation was shown in the White House with a left-wing progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, who was, I'm starting to learn over time, was, even though he did a lot of really good progressive things that by any standard helped improve things for white Americans, was also virulently racist, played footsie with the KKK, and did nothing good for African Americans in this country. And the fact of the matter is that, remember, the Alamo was popularized in American culture by, the Disney movies, Davy Crockett, king of the wild front. Davy Crockett was one of the American folk heroes who died at the Alamo. And the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of who's who of American history at the Alamo. And the Alamo, seems like a historic story until you reframe it about the fact that they're basically fighting for freaking slavery. And, on Twitter, which is what caused this podcast to be made, I'm sitting here enjoying to no end a bunch of people reminding Texans that want to have their standard state holiday where it's like, remember the Alamo? Oh, yes, you too, Betty. Remember the Alamo? Are you having your Alamo cake later? Oh, yes, I'm totally having my Alamo cake. There is no Alamo cake. But the fact of the matter is that remember the Alamo is a big deal in Texas. Texans love celebrating it, but the fact of the matter is that they are celebrating slavery because that's what the Texans were fighting for. And the thing that I seem to see, based on a single day on Twitter, but I totally see it happening, is the Christopher Columbusizing of the Alamo. And what could have happened in the last couple of months that is making this possible? You could make the argument that it's a historical trend, a combination of Me Too and BLM and, younger generations not buying into the propaganda and the jingoism of the American empire as a whole are, not buying Christopher Columbus coming over here and, immediately deciding that the entire population of the New World would make great slaves. Like, immediately. That was unique to him. Slavery existed well before Christopher Columbus, and will, unfortunately, given the nature of how evil humans are, at least as far as sexual slavery, will exist long after Christopher Columbus. But the fact of the matter is that very few people meet an entire new culture and then immediately decide that they should be slaves. That's kind of unique to him, at least based on what I've seen, right? So the fact of the matter is that Christopher Columbus is not a good guy, but it's taken some time to kind of change that image of popular American folk hero who, tried to prove that the world wasn't flat and, was looking for China and wanted to get rich, but, whoops, found America. Whoa, there's nobody here except some Native Americans, and, it's tragic what happened to them, but, we'll put them on some lunch boxes and have some nice, don't pollute commercials, but otherwise they're okay with it now, right? So, we've kind of moved past Christopher Columbus, but it took time, right? It took time to slowly but surely claw it back from, well, let's just say there's a certain subset of American culture that wants their own holiday, because if the Irish Americans get a holiday and the African Americans get a holiday, then why shouldn't this subset of American culture get their own holiday? And they're basically the last people left that are defending Christopher Columbus, except a few people on the right. And in my opinion, what's happening with the Alamo is probably going to be a lot quicker than that, in part because Texas literally just decided that it was going to repeal the mask mandate, right? Texas voted MAGA. There's a lot of really good blue people in Texas, but they're hostage to the majority on the right. And the fact is that they want to kill us, right? Aside from ignoring virus stuff, it's just crazy. Now, the reason I want to bring Wagner into this is Wagner was a gifted composer, whether, no matter what you thought of his political views, or what was done with his music later, Wagner was definitely a gifted composer. If you've ever listened to any of his symphonies, especially Ring of the Nibelung, Flight of the Valkyries, it's amazing. The man was talented. The man was also later affiliated with Nazis, and even now in the state of Israel, it is very, very controversial to play Wagner. Now, first of all, the man was anti-Semitic. He was not, I would argue, based on the single Wikipedia article I just read about him, virulently anti-Semitic in the sense that while he was definitely left-wing and socialist, and he definitely had composed some anti-Semitic writings, it doesn't seem to be like the focus of his career. He was more focused on left-wing things and just seemed to basically do what a whole lot of other idiots at the time did, which was, use those of the Jewish faith as a scapegoat for everything that was wrong with the world, particularly in Germany. But the fact is that was enough, right? The fact that he was a nationalist, the fact that he did help recreate the psyche and the popular culture that was in the imagery that the Nazis used to basically reinvent German society in the Weimar Republic. His ideas were the soil on which Nazism was planted and bloomed, right? So, to put this in context, one of the most startling and foundational moments of my life was when I was in a social studies class. And we had a very awesome social studies teacher who had traveled the world and climbed Mount Everest and was very multicultural. And this was not as unique and this was not as widespread in the 80s as it is now. And in particular, multiculturalism in a place like Colorado it just wasn't as popular as it is now. And she opened my eyes in a lot of ways. And one of the things that she did is she wanted us to see the world from other people's perspectives. And so she basically herself put together this slideshow playing a song that I'd never heard of before, setting the framework of, what it would feel like to be a German citizen in the 1920s, when your republic is going to hell in a handbasket. And then this was the first time I'd ever heard the song "Tomorrow Belongs to Me." And if you've never heard it before, you should listen to it because it's a very well-crafted song. Just like Birth of a Nation used cinematic techniques that were never used before. It was the first of its kind and was incredibly popular and powerful evil propaganda. Tomorrow Belongs to Me does a really good job of saying it's okay to be a Nazi, right? And the thing is that this experience showed me how to see the world from other people's eyes. It did not make me in any way, shape, or form at that time or at all or ever sympathetic to Nazis. But it did help me understand, which is what my teacher was trying to do, how people can get swept up in this kind of thing, right? I understand MAGA. I don't support MAGA. I don't agree with MAGA. And frankly, I never can and will excuse people voluntarily falling into this, right? I know there's a lot of people in the world that do, and I don't. I don't give MAGA a break. I don't, and I never will, right? Because, now, do I want to make the mistake that Europe did at the end of World War I and penalize all MAGA? There's a part of me that does, but I'm smart enough intellectually to realize that if we do to MAGA what they deserve, and at this point they really deserve consequences for their actions, but if we did that to 73 million people, there would never be peace in this country. Never. But the fact of the matter is that they deserve it. Now, I'm getting off the original topic, but I at the same time I'm not, right? Wagner was not only part of the soil, blood and soil, that Nazism was born in, but it was a personal favorite of Hitler's. And as a result, it was a personal favorite of everybody in the Nazi Party. And part of the reason that, despite the fact that Wagner died long before Nazism was even a blip on anybody's radar, the reason it's so controversial to play it in Israel today is because, first of all, there are still Holocaust survivors alive today, although very few, but there are definitely descendants of Holocaust survivors. And the thing is that Wagner was played in the camps of the concentration camps. So, you're being taken off in industrial amounts to be killed in concentration camps. And the music that you're listening to, while they do this, as gas is pumped into the chambers and you are so desperate for oxygen that you literally leave claw marks with your fingernails in the walls that are still there to this day, is Wagner. So why am I bringing up the Alamo and Wagner together, right? The reason I'm bringing them up together is to explain to our nice white parents, which, by the way, is a fantastic podcast series that I cannot recommend enough if you need to understand how racism and well-meaning parents are mixed together in education. And what made me realize that the culture war is the only war that matters is to understand that there is a price for Make America Great Again, right? In other words, Trump has accelerated the stakes of the culture war, which was basically this American version of the Cold War between the left and the right that has been happening. You could make the argument forever, but I would say that the latest bout basically happened with Brown versus Board of Education, where we forced segregation to stop and gave African Americans a chance at education and began a series of reforms that basically resulted in the multicultural society that we're trying to have today. Now, obviously, something like Black Lives Matter would not have happened if we had succeeded in that integration. If integration had really genuinely been successful, we would not have murder cops killing black people with impunity. Right? Now, law enforcement is a problem everywhere, right? There are societies that have cops that go off the reservation in every country. But it's unique to this country. Racism really seems to attract a disproportionate amount of people in law enforcement. Otherwise, we wouldn't see the kinds of things that we see. Now, would we? But the reason I'm bringing this up is that people in the center, I don't care what people on the right think, but people in the center need to understand that they are going to be shocked, not just with Remember the Alamo, or Dr. Seuss, or Mr. Potato Head, or Dungeons and Dragons, or areas that they thought had nothing to do with left versus right. And the fact of the matter is that there are going to be a lot of areas that are sacred cows to white people that are going to be co-opted by the left and co-opted by other cultures that have long since been suppressed, and people will have none of it. Now, it's going to start with Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben, areas that are actually flagrantly racist, but I got news for you folks. It's not going to stop there. It's not going to stop with areas that are just basically actually racist. And I'm okay with that. Because there needs to be a price for Make America Great Again. There needs to be a price for having a toxic, hypocritical culture like the American Empire. And it's going to take a while before we decide what is okay from white culture to sit next to black culture or Hispanic culture or Indian culture or whatever, because America is constantly reinventing itself, and until the right gets put in a box and sat on like they do in Germany, until we get over the First Amendment and the idea that you could say whatever you want and it's okay, we're never going to have cultural peace in this country. We're never going to have consensus as long as hate speech is considered not only tolerable, but basically literally constitutionally protected speech. This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright 2021.
to fight the forces of evil!